This week's theme was inspired by the title of my favorite song by Elton John, which is Mona Lisa's and Mad Hatter's. You don't have to be familiar with the song to listen to the episodes, but if you haven't, it's one of the most underrated of his songs, I think. On Monday, we talked about how Da Vinci's Mona Lisa wasn't as famous as it is now until it was stolen in 1911, and how our mind tricks us into seeing Mona Lisa's smile sometimes, and other times not so much. In this episode, I'm getting into the second part of the Elton John song title. From unknown mercury poisoning in hat factories, to the man known for inspiring the character in Lewis Carroll's book Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. And through today, even though the actual occupational disease doesn't really occur anymore. I'm your host, Emily Prokop, and this is the story behind Mad Hatters. But first, a quick message. If you like this podcast, you may be interested in other podcasts that focus on the humanities. In fact, if you search Twitter for the hashtag Humanities Podcast, you'll find plenty of shows on history, language, literature, philosophy, art, and more. These podcasts are by people who enjoy telling stories, exploring the arts in our world, and who want to share that knowledge. Some examples of podcasts you'll find are The Endless Knot, an in-depth podcast featuring history, etymology, and all-around fun facts about a different topic every episode. The Story Behind, a short narrative podcast featuring the extraordinary history of ordinary objects, people, or places, or the Archaeology Podcast Network, which features a variety of podcasts focusing on archaeology. Search hashtag Humanities Podcast today, or follow Humanities Podcasters on Twitter. And if you're a Humanities Podcaster, use the hashtag in your tweets so others can find you. Most people know mercury as being a toxic substance today. But through the 20th century, the chemical compound of mercury nitrate was used in the hat-making industry. Mercury nitrate made the outer hairs of a pelt soft and limp, so they could be pressed together easily to make felt. This process was kept a secret by the French until the Huguenots were forced to flee from France in the 1600s. When they came to England, they shared the secret, and it became widespread. It was also known as carroting, since the process turned pelts of white rabbit fur to a reddish-orange color. Mercury at the time wasn't known for being toxic, and it was used to treat a number of medical problems, including syphilis. Physicians were seeing patients who were treating themselves with a mercury ointment, exhibiting similar symptoms of excessive salivation and gingivitis, and the psychotic symptoms of shyness, loss of self-confidence, anxiety, fear of ridicule, and an explosive temper. The syphilis and treatment were described in the 18th century as a night with Venus being followed by the lifetime with Mercury. In the 18th century, due to poor ventilation in hat-making factories and the prolonged exposure to mercury nitrate, some workers began exhibiting similar symptoms like anxiety, depression, irritability, loss of coordination, slurred speech, and trembling, which became known as Hatter's Shakes. Danbury, Connecticut was known the world over as Hat City because of the number of hats manufactured there. And they even coined the term Danbury Shakes for the symptom, which the Board of Health knew about, but didn't do much to stop the use of mercury because it wasn't affecting anyone else in the town, other than the hat workers. The phrase mad as a hatter also became part of everyday speech to describe someone exhibiting similar symptoms to those affected by mercury poisoning. One famous name believed to have suffered was Boston Corbett, a hat industry worker responsible for leading his regiment of the New York Cavalry to track down John Wilkes Booth following the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Corbett disobeyed orders to capture Booth and instead shot and killed him. He was cleared of the blame and declared a hero by many, but years later he was put into a mental asylum after pulling a gun and threatening a group of people at the Kansas State House. He managed to escape the asylum, however, and disappeared, never to be seen again. It was finally in the 1940s when mercury use in hat making was banned in the United States. It may seem like this makes perfect sense when Lewis Carroll wrote Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, using this common disease to explain the quirks of the character of his Mad Hatter. But it was the repetition of this theory that led many to believe that it was true. In fact, the real inspiration for the character was neither mad from mercury poisoning, nor was he even a hatter. Johnny Depp described his portrayal of the Mad Hatter in the 2010 film Alice in Wonderland as a victim of mercury poisoning, including the carroting effect you see in his hair and eyebrows.
I think he was poisoned. Very, very poisoned. And I think it just took effect in all his nerves. It was coming out through his hair and through his fingernails, through his eyes.
But the movie portrayal and Johnny Depp's character analysis may have been a bit different from Lewis Carroll's interpretation. Remember when I said one of the traits of mercury poisoning was shyness and anxiety? The character of the Mad Hatter, both in the book and as described by Depp for the movie, was extremely extroverted. Carroll's Mad Hatter wasn't described as suffering from shaking, aside from constantly checking his watch and shaking it, but that was more to show his obsession with time, which was explained in the book as a result of his singing being interrupted by the Queen of Hearts, exclaiming, "He's murdering the time! Off with his head!" In fact, many scholars believe the Mad Hatter was based on an eccentric porter and cabinet maker, Theophilus Carter of Oxford, England. Carter became known for displaying the invention of an alarm clock bed, which tipped the sleeper out of bed at the designated hour he wanted to awaken. This invention was displayed at the Great Exhibition in Hyde Park in 1851. Actually, there were 2 versions displayed, neither of which were credited to Carter, but the idea was somehow attributed to him over the years. By the way, I'm pretty sure I remember a similar bed in episodes of The Jetsons, so maybe the bed was ahead of its time and we just haven't gotten to it yet. Charles Lutwidge Dodgson, better known as Lewis Carroll, would have been aware of Carter and his eccentricities, including his reputation for standing outside his shop in his signature top hat, which gave him the nickname the Mad Hatter. Carroll has denied any of his characters being based on real people, even though many believe Alice was based on a 7-year-old named Alice Little Carroll once traveled with aboard a small boat to Oxford, where he would have met or at least heard of Carter. When a photograph surfaced of Carter, scholars compared it to the illustrations from the original books, as drawn by Sir John Tenniel, and noticed the same recessed chin and overdeveloped nose, adding to the belief that Carroll had based his character on Carter and not an actual Mad Hatter. The role of Johnny Depp was played by Nick from the Epic Film Guys podcast. Information from this episode was sourced from cas.org, naturalnews.com, history.com, the New York Times, and more links, which can be found in the show notes at thestorybehindpodcast.com. Follow on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at StoryBehindPod, or subscribe on your favorite podcast app so you'll never miss an episode. Thanks for listening.